Welcome to Manga in Color, the show that takes a predominantly black and white medium and asks, hey, what if we splashed a bit of color in there? To do this, we first discuss a topic to do with manga, from storytelling, world building, art, characters, and so on. Then we find a page that connects with our topic, and I bust out the colors to try and build upon the existing page in this normally black and white medium. With this being our first episode, before we get into our topic, let's have a brief overview of what manga is and where it came from. Manga is a style of comic from the far-off island nation of Japan, deriving from the words man for whimsical or impromptu and ga for picture. Manga dates back to the 12th century, but the late 18th century is when the word manga was first coined. Continuing to the early 19th century, it became mass-produced, though it represented something more like picture books, telling a story solely through full-page pictures. It wasn't too long afterwards that manga did start to adopt the panelled system we're familiar with today. Come the early 20th century, American-style comic strips started arriving in Japan. This influence led to Japanese artists blending American styles into their own works. This influence would increase dramatically after World War II, with Japan's values shifting from nationalism to a focus on growing its economy through industry. Japanese artists now had a lot more freedom with the art they created, and a lot more exposure to the outside world arts. This led to the creation of Mighty Atom, known as Astro Boy in the West, by Tezuka Osamu, who would gain the title of the godfather of anime and manga for it. Mighty Atom introduced a lot of elements that are now staples in manga, like his character design and arcing stories, as well as introducing action-packed scenes that made use of multiple angles and flowing panel designs that gave a more cinematic feel to the page. Ultimately, Mighty Atom would be the first manga to be turned into a Japanese animated TV series known as anime, and helped pave the way for other conversions of manga to anime, where these stories could reach a much wider audience. Manga would continue to grow, breaking into two main genres: shonen, aimed at boys and adult men with themes of action, sport, sci-fi, and shoujo, aimed at girls and women with themes of romance, drama, slice of life, and superheroines. As time went on, manga would both become further refined in how it was produced, while also exploring uncharted territories of how to tell and depict stories. Something manga became very good at is subverting its own tropes. For example, in the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of shonen manga was built around physically powerful masculine men protecting justice with their fists. Fist of the North Star being a prime example. As a counter to this trope, manga like Dragon Ball was created depicting a super powerful small young boy who appeared even stronger than these big muscle-bound characters. Shortly after that, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure took these symbols of extreme masculinity and made them into melodramatic caricatures of themselves. These subversions would always be done with respect for what came before, but would also continue to further push the medium forward. Manga would continue iterating on itself, delving into more nuanced ideas and crafting more complex worlds that tell its stories. An increasing number of manga would be converted into anime, generating a wide audience that then wanted to see where their favorite anime came from, leading to more manga readers, which in turn would lead to more anime being produced, making a growing feedback loop. Although manga translation wasn't very commonplace at the time, localization and dubbing had been discovered as a much cheaper way of creating new media for TV with European and Western audiences. Although dubbing Japanese anime to English had been done since the 60s, there was now a lot more content to localize to the West, meaning in the 90s, suddenly there was a huge amount of anime coming to non-Japanese screens. This all led to the manga industry exploding. Each year, more and more new manga series coming out, with 21 new series in 1980 compared to the 112 in 1999. Even though this doesn't define the quality of the material, there was definitely more interest from audiences and investors alike. Today, manga is now translated and read all over the world, drawing audiences in with its unique style of long-form storytelling, consistent flow of content from its artists, and impressive artwork. Currently, out of the top 10 best-selling comic volumes in the world, 5 of them are manga, showing the huge readership this style has. Now that we're all brushed up on the history and origins of manga, let's get stuck into today's topic. So why isn't manga commonly in color? As manga has refined its style, that question became more and more complicated, but the first answer is efficiency. Plenty of manga is drawn by one artist who needs to consistently release the chapter of usually 19 pages a week, so to save time, these artists define details solely through line work. You also have to consider that some manga artists are highly specialized in line work and would rather just create art in that style. To add on to that is the art style itself. Over the more than 100-year history of manga, it has developed its own way to express motion and character without color. Now, let's go deeper into these topics. A lot of this need for efficiency is dictated by the publisher. Maintaining a reader base is much easier when you're updating weekly, and it's much cheaper and faster to print black and white comics. A color variant would require better quality paper, printers, more ink to be used, and just adding a lot more variables into the printing process. This makes manga itself very cheap to sell and easier to consume, leading to more readers who will eventually buy merchandise, the compilation volumes, and watch the anime. The industry itself was built around this black and white model. Now, this next point is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. With the industry being built around this black and white model, artists with goals of becoming manga artists would focus on fitting into that model. They would go to school to specifically develop skills to draw line work and grey shading quickly and efficiently, which meant that although they may have the capacity to colour, their familiarity with the principles and skill set to colour were not the standard their line work was. Lastly, the manga style itself. Just like how any style develops over time, many artists have reiterated over the same ideas of how to draw something, steadily improving it. This creates a visual shorthand, a language that is suited towards the medium and the constraints they've been presented with. In the case of manga artists, their restraints are black and white, A5 pages, and using a panel system. Over a huge amount of time, they kept improving on how to tell a story within these constraints until we have what we have today, while still pushing that style even further. This got to the point where audiences and artists alike wanted manga in black and white because the style was so compelling to be read. The high contrast between two levels of brightness without saturation or tone could make for some really intense artwork. So to put this all together, manga started in black and white and continued to stay in that format, taking advantage of what could be done with the constraints it set itself, both manufacturing and creative-wise. It eventually got to a point where it was much better to stay in black and white than to introduce the variable of color to the equation. An identity had already been formed for what manga was, and there was no expectation to progress to color. Leading on this, you have to ask, could you add color to manga? And if you could, should you? The nice thing is that question has been answered for us in a multitude of ways. The most well-known answer would of course be anime, manga that has been transformed into an animation. When manga makes the jump to anime, there is an exchange where some elements are lost and others are gained. So let's look at some comparisons between shots of anime and manga to see what is lost and what is gained. This first panel from My Hero Academia shows the hero, All Might, arriving in what is becoming a hopeless situation in order to save his students. In this panel, you can see so much tension and drama. The eyes are first led to the tie being ripped, and then to All Might's face as he pledges to protect everyone. Even the ripples in his shirt have the high contrast of the black shading and white midtone with a grey blender to help define the form of the character. All this is cloaked by smoke to help insinuate the intensity and speed at which he is acting. To compare this to the same frame of the anime, a similar composition is there, and even similar tones with his shirt, but that same level of tension and drama is missing. The starting point, the tie, gets lost with All Might's body, and the contrast tones on his shirt now are blended by that grey tone instead of adding to that tension. All the while, the smoke effect is no longer a part of the scene, but more so a background element. Even with the added element of colour, it is overall a shot with less emotion and drama. But it isn't fair to compare anime's single frames to manga, for its strength lies in its quantity. Instead of just a single moment in time, we're presented with 24 every second. Accompanied with music, sound effects, and dialogue, each of these shots blends together to create smooth, lifelike images on the screen. It makes the two hard to compare, at least visually, because they're competing in two different spaces and have different things to offer in the ways of storytelling. Another quick example is this moment from Dr. Stone, where our members of the Kingdom of Science are pumping air into a furnace in order to smelt iron. There is so much character and energy expressed in the page by each character. It creates a genuine feeling of the present stakes and passion from each of them. Comparing once again to the anime, everything is there, but it feels much more held back and flat without motion. It becomes pretty clear that comparing manga to anime isn't a good way to see what it would look like if it were coloured. But what about examples of black and white manga that have been coloured? Well, I have two examples, each that take a very different approach. The first being the Dragon Ball Z full colour manga. In this manga, all the line work is maintained, but now all and any white segments are coloured in and any black segments intended to reflect a certain color are now that color. As well as that, the majority of the coloring is done in two-tone, with a mid-tone and shading tone making the manga appear similar to the anime. Though, comparing this manga to the anime, it's still missing out on the painted backgrounds and uses highlights far less often, making things sometimes feel flat. Comparing it to the original manga though, it can end up being a matter of opinion over which is better. The Dragon Ball Z manga only really stuck with two tones, white and black, opting for different kinds of hatching and cross-hatching for shading and texture instead of grey tones. This gave the manga a high contrast look and also meant that the introduction of two-tone colours was pretty seamless in the colour version. But similar to a piece of literature, where elements are left to the reader's imagination, when you omit something like colour, it instead must be filled in by the reader. By placing these colours into the comic, the artist has tipped their hand, showing the answer to the colorization of the world, which yes, makes it easier for the reader, but limits the scope and beauty of the image to what's on the page. This just means that depending on the reader's taste, the presence of colour can either be a boon or a weakness. Now, for some who want to read the manga with it maintaining these similarities to the anime for nostalgia reasons or just because they like the style, that's fantastic and I'm glad this is there for them. But for me, with the colours being as minimalistic as they are, when I read it, I found it limiting. The other coloured manga is One Piece Coloured, which shares some similarities with DBZ Full Colour, colouring all the sections of the art that are white while maintaining all the formerly present line work. But there are a lot of distinct differences too. The most glaring is that instead of relying on a two-tone structure to match the anime, all the colours are blended, which overall gives the manga a softer look with less instances of high contrast, but also ends up giving a lot more depth and form to the characters than is in the original manga. A choice that I find interesting in the colour design is that a lot of elements are kept as solid black like the manga. This helps maintain the manga feel and heavy contrast even with blended colours. A final note is this white glow that sometimes surrounds a character in panels. The intention is to help the character silhouette stand out on the page. This is in both the original manga and the coloured. In both, it definitely highlights the characters, but in colour, it is doing far more work. You can see that by adding colour to manga, you improve the work, but you also risk taking away from it as well. When adding or changing an existing work, you need to be aware of the artist's original intention and make sure to hold onto that and not obscure it. Otherwise, you're at risk of losing the soul of the piece. A great example of this is a scene from My Hero Academia manga and anime, where the same few seconds are portrayed very differently, but each plays to the strengths of its medium while maintaining the soul of the moment. In this scene, our hero Midoriya has discovered a villain attacking an innocent civilian, to which he blames himself, since the closest hero, All Might, is predisposed thanks to his actions. He waits for another hero to arrive, but it seems like none will come who can deal with this villain. Then he suddenly catches a glimpse of who the villain has ensnared, to discover it is his classmate. Without a single thought, he bursts into action in a mad panic, even though he has no capacity to defeat this villain. The manga has used a full-page spread to show the extreme nature of what's going on in high detail to great effect. These exact same beats happen in the anime as well, but at the most important moment, the moment of immediate action, the anime plays to its strengths, using a dynamic camera to follow Midoriya as he desperately runs towards the villain in a panic. Both make the scene all the more powerful in its own unique way, which is why this full-page spread will be what we're colouring for today. To start off, I'm redrawing all the line work for multiple reasons, the first being that it will be far easier to colour with my own layer of line work than a scan of the manga. The second being that tracing this line work helps me understand the intention of expression far better, identifying and preserving the intended meaning. The last being it's really good practice to trace over another artist's work and see their choices and their styles from a very hands-on perspective. I especially love the line work around Midoriya's eyes, using this sort of controlled chaos of hatching and just random lines to infer tense movement and general horror. I have to say that even with a high expectation, getting into the line work, I definitely underestimated the amount of detail that gets squeezed out of each line and just the quality of the lines present. These panels are from a key moment in the story, and because of that, a lot of time and effort was put into their production. You can see that the weight and thickness of the lines are very intentional, yet still drawn in this natural way that doesn't make the piece look too refined. Especially in the hatching and cross-hatching, which achieves this perfect state in between being uniform, defining shading and contours clearly, but being loose and inconsistent, giving it this human and emotive feeling to it that both came from the character and the artist. My goal was to emulate Koei Horikoshi's line work as cleanly as possible by not just tracing over his lines but drawing them with the same energy and flourishment that was on the page. This meant that sometimes I would see that I'd correctly filled in the line, but looking back at the original work, there was something missing. It required further attempts trying to recreate the motion and action of each of the lines. This did become tricky with some of the hatching, since the scan I was tracing from didn't always make it clear when a section was solid black or just very close hatching. In some cases, I'd blend the solid black into hatching, and other times I'd just do very fine hatching, depending on context clues around the section. The whole design of this panel here, with Bakugo being consumed by the villain, is really impressive. You can see for yourself the intense drama of the scene, but there's lots of elements at work that enhance that drama. The first point of focus, Bakugo's eyes, speak the character's emotions before we even see the situation. Then your eyes move to the ominous eye behind him and the fact that the teeth and open mouth aren't his own. The way the ooze is slowly rolling over him and the almost endless void effect within the mouth creates this sense of motion in the panel that almost surprises you. Now I'm sorry to say that after doing the line work for the first two panels, I did realise I had set myself a task too big for just this one video. I do want to come back to the third panel once I've become better at this workflow, but for now I'm just sticking with these two panels, which I definitely think you won't be disappointed with the end result. Originally for Midoriya, I tried grabbing colours from the anime to see how it would look. It made it for a good jumping off point, but in the end I didn't use any of those exact tones for his skin or hair. These tones worked better in the context of the shot of the anime, where it wasn't an extreme close-up like the manga. When it came to shading, I first put blank shading across all the hatching areas, since hatching is usually, but not always, used to define points of shadows and darkness. Then placed darker tones in the typical spots, around the eyes, hairline, nose, and lower section of the hands. I then further refined from there, deepening the shadows of sections that needed it, blending shading slowly over surfaces where the progression of light to dark was longer, defining form more with shadows, and overall cleaning up my original block shadows. After all this, I finished off by applying highlights to the hair, nose, cheeks, and fingers, trying for a balance of making the colours pop while still having that intense lighting that contributed to the drama. I was really excited to colour in the panel with Bakugo though. An element of the original manga that I wanted to see coloured was the distinction between Bakugo and the villain. In black and white, it's easy for the image to look muddled when you have two characters blending like this. It can be considered a strength because that's what the artist is trying to convey. But I wanted to see what a bit more clarity would do to the art. I'm a bit biased, but I really like it with the distinction between the two characters. The most artistic license I took with introducing something new was using much darker shading on the villain's eye behind Bakugo. The area already had a lot of hatching, and from composition you could see it was further back from the perspective, but I really wanted to push that feeling of the eye looming over the scene and watching from the shadows as it performed this horrible act. For For both of these panels, I did decide not to introduce background colors, gradients, or details. This was just because I still wanted it to have the unique manga feel that comes from solid white or black backgrounds on top of the expressive line work and lots of use of hatching. I think this helps further separate the colored manga from just being an enhanced version of the anime. An issue I did run into while coloring was whether or not I was creating too much detail. You can only really infer so much information from when it comes to the form of the characters from the line work. So I would find myself sometimes, through shading and coloring, creating details that weren't expressed at all by the line work, but would add more detail to the piece. I ultimately decided I wanted to stay as true as I could to the original work, and if I were to introduce new details, it would be very subtle to not interfere with the original composition of the piece. Overall, I'm really happy with the finished product. I feel I achieved my goal of maintaining that manga feeling while adding further drama and emotion to the work, creating something that, although isn't objectively better than the manga, subjectively may be enjoyed more by some. Now, just to make sure I do return to that third panel, I did do the line work in colour for a member of the crowd. This panel is an amazing piece of art that I can't wait to dive into in a later video. Thanks so much for watching the first video from the Lore Seekers Tavern. I learned a lot putting this one together, and I'm really keen to make more videos for you all to watch. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos discussing developing and making stories and story elements, please subscribe.